But maybe you're familiar with the Spider-Man analogy. For those
yes, Spider-Man
out there that don't know, Matt Dillahunty and others have talked a lot about the Spider-Man analogy, which says, hold on.
Others would include me. I use the Spider-Man analogy quite a bit.
Hey, Paulogia, it's me, ya boy. Can I kindly ask you to reconsider your slinging of the Spider-Man fallacy?
Please, I'm begging you.
If you guys are saying, look at all this stuff we see in the Gospels from Luke and all that, that's like really specific locations, names, the types of work that somebody's doing, the right term, depending on where you're at, all of that. So this gives us great reason to trust the Gospels. And then somebody like Matt Dillahunty steps up and says, hold on, what if in 2,000 years we said, hey, look, there's a guy here writing about New York City. It's got the Empire State Building, the Statue of Liberty. Here's where it is. Here's the names of the streets. Therefore, there's a good case to be made that Spider-Man's true that takes place in New York City. Your thoughts first?
The point Braxton is making is a good one, and it's that specific locations are difficult for imposters. It's generally not recommended to include a lot of specific locations in a fictional story that's being presented as factual, unless you've done some serious homework. Because everyone knows that Iron Man is a fictional character, nobody expects to find the real Stark Tower in Midtown Manhattan. But the gospel writers clearly want their readers to think that they're telling true stories, and they use very specific locations and details. If they were making things up, they took a lot of risks in getting things wrong. But as it so happens, the gospel writers show a thorough knowledge about geography and specific locations where Jesus and the apostles taught. This might not seem like a big deal to Paulogia and his skeptical friends, but we need to remember that the gospel writers didn't have Wikipedia or Google at their disposal. For that matter, they didn't have local libraries where they could just pull out the Encyclopedia Britannica and take notes. So if the authors didn't know what they were talking about, it would be hard for them to find out a bunch of details they could sprinkle in to make their stories look more real. So what are some of the facts that they get right? They don't just get easy things right like Herod, Pilate, Jerusalem, or the Sea of Galilee. They get difficult things right. Let's focus on the Gospel of John for just a few examples. The author of John says that the Pool of Bethesda had 5 porticos. In the early 20th century, a skeptical scholar named Alfred Loisy floated the idea that this was a made-up allegorical detail. Loisy suggested that the 5 porticos represented the 5 books of the Law of Moses, and the story of Jesus healing the paralytic on the Sabbath illustrated Jesus' superiority over the law. Several decades later, archaeologists discovered that it actually had been bounded by 4 porticos around it and one across the middle. John knew that it was there and states it casually as a fact. Remember that after Jerusalem fell to the Romans in AD 70, it would have been much harder to describe this correctly unless someone had actually been there and remembered it. In John 2:12, we read that the trip from Cana to Capernaum is going down. The elevation of Cana is around 700 feet above sea level. Capernaum is around negative 700. The church fathers tell us that John's gospel was probably first published far away in Asia Minor. He was certainly not trying to impress his first audience by mentioning the tiny town of Cana. Also, archaeologists have found a site where stone water jars were found near the proposed location of Cana. John mentions that the jars used at the wedding of Cana were made of stone, and they were likely used in Jewish purification rituals. Stone jars were preferred because they were heavy, durable, and harder to make ritually unclean. Also, in John 10:23, the author mentions that Jesus walked in the colonnade of Solomon during winter. The roofed walkway would have protected Jesus from the cold winds. According to Josephus, the portico was a covered walkway on the eastern side of the temple, believed to have been constructed by Solomon himself. This is just a tiny sampler. You could fill up a good-sized book with examples just like these. Okay, so with all these preliminaries out of the way, why is Paulogia such a fan of the Spider-Man fallacy?
That's not exactly a Spider-Man analogy, at least not when I use it. I can't speak for Matt. When I use it, it's not to say that in 2,000 years people would have a good case for Spider-Man being true. The exact opposite. We're saying in 2,000 years they would not have a good case that Spider-Man is true. But if they accepted the kind of evidence that you guys are using, specifically, hey, names of the cities were names of cities, names of officials were names of officials. There are external details that try to anchor these stories in a historical time and place. Therefore, the events actually happened.
No, we're not saying because the gospel writers report a lot of difficult things right, that therefore all the miracles are true. That definitely would be silly.
Nobody says that.
No, what we're saying is that if the Gospels are truthful memoirs from people who are close to the facts, including those who had the opportunity to interview the disciples themselves, then they do not represent late traditions or people making up stories. Rather, they represent what the original eyewitnesses themselves claimed. We're also saying that the Gospel author's track record of accurate reportage gives us at least some reason to trust them on matters on which they can't be directly cross-checked, even if that doesn't constitute a full proof. These points are presumably why propositions about the dating and authorship of the Gospels are treated by critical scholars as controversial. We're often told by skeptics that eyewitnesses and people close to eyewitnesses didn't write the Gospels. Not only that, skeptics tell us that the authors wrote from distant lands, decades after the alleged events they report took place, and so they weren't in a good position to know the facts. And these gospel authors merely heard stories of Jesus from others who heard stories of Jesus from others who heard stories from Jesus, much like the game of telephone, and the stories got mixed up along the way. But the subtle, casual details mentioned throughout the documents count as evidence against the hypothesis, just as authors making gross historical or geographical blunders would count as evidence for it. And the weird thing is that Paulogia and his guests will often argue this way from time to time. He's made a couple of videos making the case that Luke was a sloppy historian because he allegedly bungled the census of Quirinius, for just one example. Okay, so let's think about this evidentially for just a moment. Would Paulogia think that it's a bigger deal if a author got a tiny geographical detail right, or if they got it wrong? If an author gets an obscure detail wrong, isn't that evidence against his reliability? So why isn't it evidence for his reliability when he gets an obscure detail right? This feels a little bit like heads I win, tails you lose. But let's let Paulogia continue.
All we're pointing out is that lots of stories, be they fiction or ideas that people actually throwing out that they would like to be true. For example, a criminal in a court case who's perhaps inventing his own alibi, he might be peppering it with details that are true. I was with my friend and my girlfriend, probably are real people, and we were hanging out at a certain park, which isn't a legitimate place, or I was in bed and he has an actual bed. Again, the fact that there are details that one can anchor doesn't necessarily mean that the events are true. And it's particularly more problematic when these events are presented that are supernatural or beyond what we would normally see. So the Spider-Man analogy really points out that you can take a story that is as obviously fiction as Spider-Man, but still have anchoring points. And that if you want to use these anchoring points as a good reason for evidence, then you would also have to accept Spider-Man. That's the point.
Okay, now this feels a little bit like shifting the goalposts by changing the analogy. Spider-Man is not a real-life criminal trying to create an alibi. Rather, it's highly detailed historical fiction, a literary genre that wasn't invented until hundreds of years after the Gospels. And the Gospels are claiming to give us testimony. It's important to keep in mind that the concept of a highly detailed and realistic historical novel didn't exist during the time that the Gospels were written. While there certainly was fiction, it was often crudely written and overly dramatic. And again, if a gospel author had decided to create a detailed historical novel, it would have been almost impossible for them to accurately gather the specific information found in the Gospels without living in that specific time and place. The more a criminal throws in real points to give his lies an air of realism, the more easily they can give themselves away if they say something wrong. Again, this is the one reason why skeptics like Bart Ehrman are so keen on pointing out that the gospel writers make numerous historical errors, showing they are not written by witnesses, but people writing far and long after the supposed events. I think Ehrman's examples of supposed historical blunders are weak sauce, but it is definitely part of his case against the historical reliability of the Gospels. So I don't think this analogy of Paul's really works, but let's go ahead and let him finish up.
Yeah, we know Spider-Man is fiction. If you're going to ask people 40 years after Spider-Man was written, people are going to say this is a work of fiction.
Yeah.
So this is an appeal to genre, and I think he's using 40 years because Michael's, I think, accepting that the Gospels were written approximately 40 years after the events of Jesus' life. Great, Michael. I think that dating is roughly correct. And he's saying if you took these people 40 years when the Gospels were written, 40 years later, that they did not accept this as fiction. The trouble is, of course, that the genres of the day were not the same genres that we're used to, and we have categories of fiction and nonfiction and that kind of thing. The Gospels, though, are presented as theological. They are attempting to present a biography, I would agree, but they are presenting stories that were probably exaggerated. They were probably grew, at least the case that I put forth is these are legends that grew over time. And of course, a legend can be anchored in actual events, just like legends of Johnny Appleseed and legends of Paul Bunyan. Those are anchored with some times and places and names that you could go back and say. So when we're saying Spider-Man We're not necessarily saying it's a one-for-one genre type thing, but I don't think that the genre of the Bible, the Gospels, is specifically a biography. I think that this is a theological treatise. So maybe we should be using Quran and maybe we should be using other things rather than Spider-Man. Just Spider-Man seems to be an effective communication as to why some of this stuff fails, because it's an argument ad absurdum in its own way a little bit. To say that if your criteria is merely that there's names and places that match, the story must be true. I think that's why it works. Genre aside.
The gospel writers present themselves as giving facts, not fiction. Their theology is rooted in real-life history.
No, not Harry Potter.
This seems to ignore the fact that ancient biographers often insist that they are telling us the truth. Let's take a look at a couple of examples of ancient historians around the time of Jesus. The Greek historian Lucian wrote a book titled How to Write History, where he stresses the historian's obligation to report the facts. He writes, "The historian's task is, 1, to tell it as it happened. This is the one peculiar feature of history, and to truth alone must sacrifice be made." The Jewish historian Josephus does a similar thing in his autobiography, writing that, quote, "veracity is incumbent on the historian." Now, scholars can debate whether Lucian and Josephus actually told the truth, but what they can't dispute is the genre that's being used, and that's historical biography. Comparing Lucian or Josephus to a Spider-Man comic would be laughably absurd. This is relevant to the Gospels because they tell us what kind of books they claim to be, and that's eyewitness reportage. We read this in Luke's prologue and in several places in John's Gospel. So why would they emphasize eyewitnesses if they're writing legend or myth? Seems pretty clear that they want their readers to know that what they're saying about Jesus can be verified by those who knew Jesus. And this is how the early church received them. For instance, writing in 150 AD, Justin Martyr refers to the Gospels as, quote, memoirs of the apostles. Okay, so if it's not a one-for-one comparison, Paulogia suggests that we take a look at other religious documents that claim to be historical records. I think that's probably a pretty good idea. He suggests the Quran. I'm thinking that we probably should go with something that is a little closer to the Gospels, so let's compare them with some of the apocryphal writings in the early Christian church. The Gospel of Peter does mention historical people such as Pilate, Herod, and the high priest, and places such as Jerusalem, but those are hardly difficult facts to get right. The author doesn't specify which Herod he's referring to, nor does he mention Annas or Caiaphas by name. The infancy Gospel of Thomas mentions Herod, Jerusalem, and Nazareth. Again, not too impressive. The Acts of Paul and Thecla does mention Paul, as well as places such as Iconium, Antioch, and Seleucia, but again, this hardly compares to the ridiculous amount of historical details that Luke gets correct about ports, overland routes, sea routes, cities, landmarks, political boundaries, titles of local officials, and so forth in the book of Acts. The historian Colin Hemmer painstakingly details 84 of these difficult facts that Luke mentioned so casually in his book, The Setting of Acts in Hellenistic History. I detail several examples in a video I'll be sure to include at the end screen. Finally, the Acts of Thomas has a handful of historical nuggets. It mentions a handful of Indian customs and the name King Gundasaurus, but most of its historical knowledge wouldn't really be all that difficult to come by. I'll be at the idea that this is an apples and oranges comparison here. I would definitely recommend that people read these other documents and compare them to the Gospels and Acts because the texture is just incredibly different. So let's just do a quick recap. The Spider-Man analogy fails to understand literary genre. It fails to account for the fact that the gospel writers get minute, difficult facts right without the help of Google or Wikipedia. And when the Spider-Man proponents do factor that knowledge in, they often act as if these details count for very little. But these are the same people who often make a big deal over alleged historical errors. And finally, the Spider-Man fallacy is a bit of a straw man, because no one is saying that because the gospel authors get mundane facts right, therefore miracles happen. At least no apologist should be saying that. Instead, what we're saying is that these casual details show us what the authors were like, which is careful, honest, and close up to the facts. They are not far removed from the alleged events and the witnesses. This view of the Gospels is a unified view. It explains the evidence much better than what I would say a schizophrenic view, where the authors are getting all these little things right, showing all these signs of truthful testimony, but suddenly at other times consider themselves free to invent and change facts. The Spider-Man fallacy should be more dead than Peter Parker's Uncle Ben.
Uncle Ben?